Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm Kieran O'Connor. At Braver Angels, we're committed to elevating a range of voices across the political spectrum, from Tea Party conservatives on the right to Democratic socialists on the left. We're committed to maintaining red-blue balance at every level of leadership, whether it's our board of directors, our staff, or even our sources of funding. We also try to maintain red-blue balance in our media products, and I've sought with the podcast to bring conservative guests on just as often as I've talked to liberals. And in some of our most interesting episodes, I've been able to bring on both together for passionate, vigorous discussions that help us better understand one another and the country we live in. That being said, I am a progressive, and I come to the podcast with my own set of experiences and biases. And I've sometimes heard from some of our red leaders and listeners that they'd like to have more of a voice in the conversation, and to show our audience what liberals, academia, and the mainstream media often miss about conservatives. To that end, I invited my friend and colleague, Paul Norris, who helps lead Braver Angels' Red Caucus, to moderate a Reds-only conversation with some of our other Red leaders, including Mark Reinecke, Elizabeth Dahl, and Barbara Farmer. I hope this conversation helps our Red listeners feel heard and gives our Blue listeners a chance to better understand our Reds in their own words. Please let me know what you think of this episode by emailing media@braverangels.org, and don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And with that, I'll turn things over to Paul Norris.
Hi, I'm Paul Norris, and I will be moderating this podcast. I think we have a really interesting topic. What do academia and the media get wrong about Reds? But let's introduce our panelists. I am a leader of the Red Caucus within Braver Angels, a California state coordinator, a practicing psychotherapist, and that's probably enough. More will probably come out later. Mark, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hello, good afternoon. I am Mark Reinecke, and I am also a member of the Red Caucus. I'm a lifelong conservative, and I'm coming to you from Chicago, Illinois. My background, I'm a clinical psychologist and a past member of the faculty at Northwestern and University of Chicago.
And Barbara, would you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Barbara Farmer. I also have a background in psychology. My specialty is cognitive science. I worked in academia for a couple of years and also in aerospace for a few years. I work with Paul on the Red Caucus, and I'm also one of the Braver Angel state coordinators.
Okay, and Elizabeth, would you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Elizabeth Dahl. I'm the director for Braver Politics at Braver Angels, and I live in Washington State, west of Seattle, on an island called Bainbridge. My background is in campaign work and political consulting. I've been in politics in Washington State for over a decade, and I have served just about in every role that it is possible to serve in on a campaign at some point in that decade. I follow politics very closely, and I spend a lot of time engaged with media and trying to identify the best path forward in politics for the purpose of depolarization.
Okay, so why this topic? There was an earlier podcast on Braver Angels by an academic who had written a book, and I don't know how much we'll end up talking about that particular podcast, but admittedly, that was a spark that got us here today. And so again, what do academia and the media get wrong about Reds is our topic. This topic just popped into my head immediately when I was asked if I would like to moderate a podcast of Reds. And I would just start out by saying, why are those two things together in the same topic? And I think the answer is we look to both to inform us and to enrich our knowledge, and quite frankly, end up being disappointed. And in the case of academia, I'm going to say I think this refers mostly to the humanities, not to the sciences, where I don't think we get that same disappointment. So with that, let's kick it off. And who would like to jump in and share their thoughts? Oh, by the way, I should say I would really like this to be interactive. Not just each people giving a speech, going on, but let's interact with each other here.
I'll go ahead and jump in terms of what, particularly academia, I think it's wrong. I think it sort of came out in the podcast you were talking about, that academia tends to portray conservatives as anachronisms, somehow relics of the past that we don't want to give up, and that it is the furthest thing from the truth. We do accept and want to see change, but we want to see change in an incremental fashion rather than through major government policies.
I would agree entirely with that. And I think part of the problem is how much of a monoculture both a lot of major media outlets, but also academia have become. I saw a paper that came out of Harvard. It was Harvard Crimson earlier this year, that 82% of faculty identified themselves as liberal or very liberal, and only 1% were conservative, and none, which is 7 faculty members in all of Harvard, would label themselves as conservative, and none were very conservative. And so it's become a monoculture. And in many ways, I think conservatives on campus are something of an endangered species and sort of set aside in the room. Now, I bring this up because I don't think it's any different at other major universities, at Michigan or UCLA or Yale. They're all kind of in the same genre. But it's important because one of the things that academics and media do talk about is the importance of diversity of opinion. And a great deal of effort has been put against this with regard to different ethnic groups or social groups or disadvantaged groups. But that same thoughtfulness about having a range of voices in a room doesn't apply to conservative thought. Conservative thought has in many ways been expunged from campus, which is, I think, to a detriment of the whoever's thinking about a problem. You want to have a range of ideas and to think about your ideas critically, because we've got problems, healthcare problems, climate change, economic problems, to be sure. And having a lot of thought and a lot of critical thought is essential to solving them.
I think you're right on, Mark, about it being such a monoculture. I actually just used that in an email immediately before we started. I have been helping put together a dinner in the Seattle area for Monica Guzman, and the struggle is to find journalists who hold the primary media sources and Seattle city government accountable, who the primary media sources will be willing to speak with and hear out rather than walk out as soon as they become aware that they're in the room with them. It is that difficult of an atmosphere in the Seattle area. It's a real bubble. I was looking at a study from Science that was just published in 2020 about journalistic bias that found 78% of media is self-identifies as either liberal or as Democrat. That leads to bias in what is covered, that leads to bias in how it's covered, that leads to bias in the different words that are used. It leads to bias in the way that sources are sought out. often I find that the conservative voice that is used as a source or that is quoted in media will be someone who doesn't actually represent conservatives all that well. Sometimes they've just picked a political moderate that they know and labeled that person a conservative. And other times they've picked someone from the extreme fringe and labeled that person representative of the mainstream. And both of those are equally frustrating. And I see both of them happen with a great deal of frequency. I was really frustrated by this study that I read because it claimed that, and this gets to the confluence of media bias and academia bias, which is it claimed they found decisively that there was no journalistic bias in what is covered, no journalistic gatekeeping. How did they come to that conclusion? Well, they created a fictitious state legislative campaign and emailed journalists at every media outlet that they could find across the country, which is on its own an astronomical and extraordinarily impressive effort, asking if that journalist would be interested in interviewing their fictitious campaign prior to their announcement of running for state legislature. And because they received equal responses to conservative and Republican identified candidates versus Democratic identified candidates, they took this to mean that there was no gatekeeping in what is covered. However, I find this to be a non sequitur, and frankly, I had difficulty believing that that made it through peer review. Because one, an interview does not necessarily mean that that story will make it into the paper. And then secondly, I work on campaigns. I would be really stunned if a reporter didn't first Google to figure out who the state legislative candidate was that they'd never heard of before. Because usually if someone's running for state legislature, they came from somewhere and you can find them with a Google search. If you can't find them with a Google search, you assume that they're going to go away because they aren't actually a credible candidate. And I would argue that the reason that their response rate was so low, the response rate was 19%, was that the only people who responded were the journalists that responded with their form letters without Googling the candidate. And whether you receive a form response to a candidate asking you for an interview does not have any bearing on whether a reporter might actually publish information from that candidate or whether that information would be fair. And I think that this is something you see academia get wrong often. I'm experiencing now almost constantly the ivory tower cloistering and the distinction between people who write about political theory and people that actually work in the field. Those things are very different. And often I'm finding that people who write papers have very little understanding of how campaigns operate in reality or how journalists respond to campaigns in reality on the field. And that's really frustrating to me. In this one podcast that we talked about with Barbara Walters, she talked about a lot of things that fell outside her actual realm of expertise. She is absolutely an expert on civil wars that happened outside the United States from World War II on forward. She is not an expert on the US Civil War, even. She is not an expert on US politics. She said something that I questioned pretty quickly into the podcast, which is that, if it wasn't for the Civil War, probably slavery would have gone on for a very long time in the US. But we were already seeing slavery being obviated across the world. And innovation was driving slavery out of practice at the same time because it was making it extraordinarily inefficient to use slaves and slave labor. While it certainly would have continued around the world and did, the idea to me that slavery would have continued forever or for a very long time if it wasn't for the Civil War, strikes me as not really super supportable as an idea. And there were so many
Elizabeth,
other.
I wonder, I wonder if I could, maybe pick out some themes that I think I'm hearing. So one theme that I think I hear that is common across academia and the media is cherry picking the data. So only picking the data and the themes that support what they're trying to accomplish. I think another thing is false reasoning, missing like really obvious explanations. For example, the podcast that you're talking about looked at Trump for the rise of the right and totally missed the antics of the left that for several years had preceded the rise of Trump. In fact, one might argue it was the antics of the left that actually got Trump elected. Another thing is the failure of peer review. So peer review that takes place with an in-group who already agree on everything. And I think another theme that I think I've heard is studying people who you don't know, you don't like, and maybe you're afraid of them. When I was at UC Berkeley, and this was a very long time ago, but I remember in an introductory psychology class, they would still admit to the history of scientific racism. And I remember, hearing about studies that were done about Black people finding out that they were fearful. They would do studies and find, yes, they're more fearful than white people, and they would conclude inferiority from that, missing the obvious explanation of, well, maybe their lives actually were scarier. So I think, these are some of the themes that I think we're seeing. And again, missing the obvious explanation for the rise of the right of the antics of the left, cities in chaos. Anyway, so let's get some other voices in the room. There is certainly an enormous amount of expertise in this room, and who else would like to weigh in?
So I'll go back to my comment about the anachronism. And it relates to a lot of what was said, especially some of the comments by Elizabeth and by you, Paul. And that has to do with the fact that the narrative that seems to come out of academia, and it is picked up by the media as well, is that the people on the right are frightened. They're frightened of change. They're frightened of new groups. They're frightened of changing demographics. And that is a wrong assumption. There is an alternate hypothesis, an alternate explanation, and that is that we do want to preserve, but we want to preserve the values on which the country was founded, the value of individual liberty, the value of small government, the value of the role of government, being to protect rights, not to provide things to people. Those are the values that I think most conservatives want to preserve. We're not afraid of incoming groups. We're not afraid of new people coming into the country, but we do want to preserve what we think made the country successful, because what we do fear is that if those fundamental values go by the wayside, then the country will probably, take a turn for the worse. So I think those are some of the ideas that really need to be corrected in the narrative. But I agree that I don't think it's going to happen easily because of all the things that Elizabeth and Mark mentioned, the unbalance of opinions, unbalance of political affiliation in both the media and in academia. In some cases, there is a study where I think it was in the history department of 40 universities, the history departments of 40 universities, the ratio of left-leaning professors to right-leaning professors was 33-1. That is not going to make for diversity of opinion, and it's not going to make it easy to change the narrative that comes out of academia.
It's interesting because I think there is an incentive to do this. It's in the Harvard study that I saw. They also asked the faculty, how many of you thought that we should have greater range of political opinion, the diversity of thought? And only 25% supported that. So they think the general perception on campus is, no, I like it the way it is. And I'm comfortable with this. Now, if you ask yourself, why would that be? These are bright, critically minded people. I think it's because progressivism works in academia. To get promoted, to move ahead, you have to have an idea that's innovative, that breaks the tradition that you've come from, that shatters the previous mode of thought, so that you will become known for a groundbreaking advance. By definition, as one faculty member, a senior administrator in our department said, no one who is not a progressive should be a leader of the department, because by definition, they can't progress. Well, all right then. I think there's an internal sense that if you are following and building upon what Barbara talks about, sort of accept, is that the right word? Established beliefs that have a long tradition from a Enlightenment perspective, the liberty of the individual and personal freedom and the like, that those challenging those beliefs will be associated with advancement in academia. You'll get promoted for it.
This strikes me as an example of innovation without reality testing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that may be part of what's going on here. I've been watching I've been taking this lecture series on Wondrium lately, Epic Engineering Failures.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the takeaways from that is innovations in engineering and building often lead to unexpected failures. But the thing is, when you build a bridge and it falls down, you can't cancel out everybody who said, well, the bridge fell down. So there's some element of reality testing, which I think is, one of the real differences between what we might call the hard sciences and the humanities, is there is this element of reality testing. You actually have to demonstrate that your ideas work. And so it's not just social approval. It's not just a social approval mechanism. There is a real world out there that has reality testing mechanism. And this is, I think, a fundamental difference that I see.
If I can comment, I think I'm pointing at Barbara on my screen here. That may be one of the reasons that both of us study cognition, is we do experiments, and if it works, we validate and test everything that we do. It's not a soft science. And that critical mindedness is key to conservative thought.
Yeah, and I think that's why conservatives do like to embrace change, but slowly, because social policy can also be tested in reality, but it can't be tested quickly. Things survive because they work. But when the narrative is to advocate for sweeping change, then there is no way to be accountable for it, because there's too many things happening at the same time to determine what leads to what leads to successful outcomes. The only thing that leads to successful outcomes are things that have been around for a while that work, and we don't want to trash them in favor of something new and quote unquote innovative just because it's new. We do want ideas to be tested, but they do need to be tested over time. You can't get a quick experimental result from a new policy.
We had
Yeah.
a phrase in our lab at Northwestern. I would encourage my students, I would say, you should have a fresh idea every day. Basically, be innovative, but recognize that 95% of them are bad. And that's the notion. Let's be free thinking. Let's be wondering about what's going to work. Let's tinker. Let's be innovative, but recognize that more often than not, you can miss.
Ask questions of your own ideas, ask questions of others' ideas, ask questions of every idea. And
Right.
I'm forever telling people that I would rather do nothing than do something that I can, through the basic application of reasoning and analysis of incentives, determine is likely to have negative unintended consequences worse than the status quo. That doesn't even have to mean that I think the status quo is good or the best. It just means that I think your proposal is worse than the existing rule.
There's a lot to be said for that. We shouldn't fall. There's always an unintended consequences to a policy shift. There's a colleague I like he's passed away, but a wonderful colleague down at Emory who said we should be bending over backwards to prove ourselves wrong. And it's rare that you will hear a politician or a political theorist adopt that critically minded stance.
And that brings up a quote that I love. I've used it often, so I apologize to people that may have heard it before. It's a Thomas Sowell quote, that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And I think conservatives appreciate trade-offs. I don't want to say more than liberals, because I don't want to speak for them, but I think we do recognize that no matter what you do, there's going to be a downside in some respect. And we really want to understand what that is before we put anything new into practice.
I think there's something. I think there's something deeply underlying this, which is a fundamental difference in the idea of trade-off between truth and social change. So I was in graduate school not so long ago and took a research class when I already thoroughly understood scientific research and the scientific method. And I was struck by what was taught, which is basically find a group that you want to help and design a study to help them. And this is fundamentally, I believe, and I don't say it's a Marxian idea to reject it per se. If Marxism worked, I would be on top of it and promoting it right away. The problem is it doesn't really work. The notion of truth that we are going to decide what happens and then design the study, find the truth that promotes that goal, fundamentally doesn't work. The thing that works is to find out what is true. And then once we know what is true, to then discover what we can do. So I think there's a fundamental way, actually, in with Marxism, actually comes from a tradition that goes back millennia, which is magical thinking. Magical thinking, the belief that we can change reality by our own thinking and by our own minds, rather than by studying and learning. And I think a prime example of that is Chernobyl. That's what happens when you decide that you can manipulate reality in your own mind rather than finding out what's true and working from there. So I think Marxism is a great thing to leaven, to share the results of let's say, capitalism, of searching for an external reality-based truth. So that's a thought that I've had.
And also to speak into your therapeutic world, it's also kind of the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, the idea that you can test your own thoughts and determine whether they have a basis in reality. And if they don't have a basis in reality, that you can choose how you respond to those thoughts. and you can rewire your neural processes in a way that helps you be less anxious about distorted thoughts that are not reflective of reality.
It's funny that you bring that up, Elizabeth. I actually love that you bring that up, because I've often thought that in some ways Braver Angels acts as a form of cognitive behavioral therapy by changing how we view each other, regardless of which side we're on, in the context of having to interact with each other and to really listen.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is a little bit of cognitive behavioral therapy going on there.
It's a,
I think I'd agree with that.
a gentle exposure trial.
Habituation to the aversive stimuli.
There's an irony in this. So several of us here actually have some kind of a therapeutic role in what we do. I'm actually a long ways away from being a CBT practitioner. I'm just more in the realm, more like Carl Rogers is really what works for me, and it's just accept the fact that we're irrational. And actually, to just come from a really open-hearted place of listening.
Mm-hmm.
And what I find is that if somebody will really listen to a person, that person's thoughts will begin to reorder very often.
Mm-hmm.
They'll begin to see the contradictions. They'll begin to see the ways that they're not facing reality. So, I will on occasion, like ask somebody to reality test their thinking, but generally speaking, I just kind of accept, that people are inherently irrational beings, and if they can find some realm in which they can act rationally, wonderful. So to me, that's the role of science. This is a place in which utterly irrational human minds can act in a rational way and actually make meaningful and real progress. So that's kind of an aside, but it was just a bit of irony that I thought, I wanted to mention that.
Yeah. It's interesting too. I think in terms of things that liberals or blues get wrong, I would say it's to recognize that conservatives, Republicans, Reds, we're a heterogeneous lot. The way that you think about things is different than mine and than Barbara. There's the full spectrum from, kind of populist right to libertarians within the broad realm of conservative thought. And it's, as Barbara notes, this is a stream of thought that goes back centuries. And it's a noble stream of thought. And my concern then is that we get lumped in together. And so often people view conservatives or Republicans in caricatured terms as a threat to the republic, as a bucket of deplorables, just to be disregarded. And that really does a disservice to the nuance and the range of thinking in conservative thought and sophistication of conservative thought.
Well, I once considered myself a Berkeley radical.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a Democrat, for a very, very long time. And actually, as is in the case with a lot of people, just recognizing what works economically, what actually produces value. Before you can share value, you have to create it. And I think that's the fundamental realization. I remember, a story told about Tom Sowell, that, he was a leftist, far leftist when he began studying economics. And Milton Friedman observed, don't worry about that. He's too smart. He's going to figure things out. And he did. So nobody put any pressure on him. And he figured it out.
I was a Democrat too. I grew up in a family of Democrats and followed the herd at home, and many of my family members, most of my family members are still Democrats. But I think I started to become more conservative when I had my son. I began to really appreciate, of course, the difference between Democrats and Republicans was a little bit different back in the 90s, but I began to appreciate more the some of the more traditional values and the importance of instilling those values in future generations. And but I still voted Democrat for a while. It took a long time for me to actually change my behavior, but I changed my thinking first, and then my behavior slowly followed. And it was reading Thomas Sowell that what the conflict I was feeling inside, he articulated what I couldn't say, and now I'm a little bit better at saying it. I'm not great at saying it, but Thomas Sowell really he gave voice to intuitions that I had that sort of blossomed after reading him. Should be required reading for everybody. People may not always agree with him, but he definitely helps you clarify your thinking. So this is like an advertisement for Thomas Sowell, I think.
The change for me, so I was a kid who actually grew up in a trailer park. And so the people I grew up around, were lower middle class. Had, no real expectations of going anywhere. But thanks to Sputnik, it became really important to find, every smart kid and educate them. So thank you to the Soviet Union for really helping me along. But actually, when I really started to get it was when I went to work for Apple Computer, and I began to understand that a corporation can actually create value, not just, rent seeking or, extracting money, but I began to understand creation of value. And for me, that caused tremendous change. And also to understand, that opportunity really did exist. That was when I really got it. I mean, I could have gotten it before then, but I was a slow learner. But that was when I really understood opportunity really can exist. If you're willing to take chances, if you work hard. Yeah, that was a soul-changing time for me.
I did not grow up in a Democratic family. My family was very conservative, but nonetheless, I was always, the way that you put it, Paul, a reality tester. And I used to be a pretty reactionary conservative, more populist in my thinking. And I became much less reactionary when I started working in politics. And you could say that working in a purple district reality tested whether my populism and whether being a reactionary actually resulted in the outcome that I wanted, which was more conservatism in government, a smaller government, better policy for better outcomes for everyone. And I saw that populism did not net that, and being a reactionary didn't net that. I discovered that the only thing that actually resulted in changing anything was reaching across political divides and learning to understand people that weren't like me, and weaving the opposition to my policy stances into the way that policy was written and into my understanding of opposition to certain policies, because it was only through understanding the best and strongest arguments against good policy or against what I thought of as good policy that anyone could actually write better policy, that anything could actually get passed. In the legislature, you couldn't overcome a majority that was opposed to your policy without taking into account their various reasons for opposing it. And it was only through understanding those, through hearing from people who disagreed with me, and conversations across a variety of divides, that I was actually able to change things. And that became my reality test. Which of these interaction types, which of these thoughts actually led me to the outcome that I wanted? How did I actually decrease the size of government? How did I actually make my county more efficient? Well, it turns out I actually did that by speaking across divides. I actually did that by learning that, hey, Democrats, they're my friends, they're my neighbors, they're people that I care a lot about who also have great ideas about how to improve the community. And sometimes I can even incorporate those ideas and we can work together for good outcomes. But if I would have never approached them, the only thing I was doing was screaming into the wind and becoming increasingly angry. It wasn't useful, it wasn't helpful. I needed that reality test, as you said, Paul. And I think that, at least to me, that is a major part of my conservatism, is that solutions orientation, that outcome orientation, and the reality testing of it.
Yeah, the theme of reaching across the aisle. So important. So, I mean, I would think that if somebody was going to write a book about civil wars and how to prevent them, rather than demonizing the other side, one might actually want to come up with a fair and honest characterization of the other side that showed respect and maybe actually a little bit of love and a little bit of liking. Maybe that's how we prevent civil wars, not by studying the other side like a bug under a microscope with a pin stuck through them, picking out the worst, of course, rather than a broad range.
Mm-hmm.
I did think it was interesting that she mentioned at least the leftist violence in the 70s, but didn't mention how that leftist violence came to an end or why.
I mean, I certainly remember, I remember being at Berkeley. I actually got in Berkeley at 66. And at the time, I was very much a part of that. But I look back now and I just realized, the personalization of politics, the viciousness, phrases like these are our non-negotiable demands. But, I mean, there's a long history of both sides of political violence. As I come to understand, if you look back to the strike breakers. So it's a very, very sad and long history, but I do think that the politics of personal destruction, this is what we really, really need to get away from. This is what's killing us, I think. I just heard somebody mention the other day in a conversation, a second grade teacher who was actually, for the first time ever, seeing vicious arguments between kids in the second grade. And I go, oh my God, oh my God, I hope that's not true. I mean, it was just an anecdote, but oh, good Lord.
Well, I'll share a quick anecdote with you. And this goes back to the 60s at Berkeley, because I was just a teenager then. And I remember my father was a regent of University of California. And so he was going to a board meeting across on campus and, driving in his car. I was sitting next to him and a crowd came around and started hurling things and swearing at him and it was tumultuous Berkeley in the 60s. And my dad, instead of trying to push through the car, he goes, wait a second. And he stops the car and rolls down his window and says, hi, I'm Ed. And the young man, the person on, the guy who was throwing eggs at the car or whatever, just stopped. He was stunned. He goes, hi, I'm Ed, let's talk. And the group around the car just went quiet. There is something to be said for actually rolling down the window and reaching out your hand to someone with a different point of view.
I'm not sure that would happen now, Mark.
It would be very hard, but my dad pulled it off in Berkeley in '68, so.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if somebody did an experiment to see if that would go over now, or if the eggs would continue to fly.
Yeah.
one of the most frustrating things about geographic sorting is that it becomes more and more difficult to find people who disagree with you, because the ones that do and that want to continue to exist alongside you keep their heads down and their mouths shut. I see it every day on Bainbridge Island, and I know people who will never admit publicly that they're Republican, but behind closed doors, they have me over for dinner and we talk politics all night.
Mm-hmm.
It's, I live in such a political bubble. It is, the way that Seattle is just absolutely horrifying. You think of media as a political bias, a creature of political bias, and it is that and more in the Seattle area. I was having a conversation actually with my Western Washington Alliance on our way to a political debate on the east side of the state, and we were talking about Seattle media, and my realization was that there is really no honest, moderate right media, because they have forced everyone to either identify as an actual conservative or to be progressive left. And everyone that exists in Seattle in journalism that claims to be moderate, that claims to be centrist, is branded by primary media sources and respected media sources in Seattle as the far right. Center left, you're the far right. Center right, you are the far right. And it has turned so many moderate Democrats into people who self-identify now as conservatives. I think of two people in particular, but one most notably. You've all heard probably of Christopher Rufo. Christopher Rufo ran for Seattle City Council in 2019 as a Republican. He was a mild-mannered, kind of meek, honestly, cinematographer, with an immigrant wife. And then someone harassed his wife and kids in the pickup line at their school. And now he's a nationally known conservative writer and voice on the conservative right. That's what happens in Seattle. The far left pushes people to either sit down, shut up, and not ever make a peep, or to become as vocal as they possibly can. One of our Seattle radio show hosts, Ari Hoffman, ran as a Democrat in 2019 for Seattle City Council. Now he's a conservative talk radio show host. Another, our Seattle City Attorney, Ann Davison, who made waves around the country when she was elected as what the media called the first Republican elected in Seattle. But she ran as a Democrat for Seattle City Council in 2019. And she was told by King County Democrats that she was too white. And then she joined the Republican Party and ran as a Republican.
There is the saying, I didn't leave the left left me. I stayed in the same place. I think a lot of people experience that. Dave Rubin, of course, is a famous example, the podcaster. Yeah, how far the left has gone. I sometimes find myself longing, what happened to Democrats like, JFK? And, of course, he's idolized now, but still, what happened, to sensible Democrats who wanted policies that actually worked and, were not driven completely by ideology?
Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? And we all know the answer is they get primaried out. The the gerrymandering and balkanization of our political system has led people with a moderate voice to lose in the primary. And what you find is that, how would you put it? Anger and fear sell. It generates votes, it activates your base, whether it's on the left or the right, but it leaves the entire center left, center right, the independents with no representation really whatsoever.
Do you think, this is a hypothetical, but I assume the people on the left believe the same thing has happened on the right, that the more moderate voices on the right have been left out as well, to a large extent. I would think that's their perception.
Right.
Curious as to this group, whether what your perception of that. I mean, it is. I agree with you. It is a unfortunate process that we've gone through, but have we gone through it on both sides, and how do we fix that?
Honestly,
yeah, go ahead.
As someone with a lot of political and campaign experience, honestly, I see it as less the fault of primaries and more primaries being an indicator of something else that's wrong. That something else being our own increased geographic and partisan sorting and political polarization. Being in a purple district where I grew up, and where I still work sometimes on campaigns, is explaining to my candidate that they need to win the primary without losing the general election. And it drives the competitiveness of the district, drives them toward the center, even in the primary. When the district is non-competitive, it doesn't matter whether you have a top two primary or whether you have a party primary. The goal is just to out extreme your opponent, whether you are on the extreme left or on the extreme right. If you are in a deep blue district, then you run toward the far left. If you're in a deep red district, you run toward the far right. And nobody runs toward the center. Maybe sometimes in a deep blue district, you have a red who runs toward the center, or in a deep red district, you have a blue that runs toward the center that actually tries to make it a competitive race. Those don't happen very often. Most of the time in deep blue and deep red districts, a lot of people just don't vote in the primaries. A lot of the rational people, the thoughtful people, the ones that actually wonder, hey, can this election be won? They bury their heads in the sand and they stop voting because they're disenfranchised by the lack of competition. I think that lack of competition drives a lot more of the political extremism that you see coming out of primaries than the primary system itself.
So we talk in Braver Angels about, being more alike than different when we speak to people on the other side. I think we've all found that we actually thoroughly like our friends on the left, even if we don't agree with them, and that there is a lot of overlap in what we want. We talk about common ground, but our political representatives don't seem to share that view, or at least not publicly anyway. How do we, as Braver Angels or just as private citizens, influence that to nudge maybe our political representatives to be a little bit more forgiving of those on the other side and to work together? Because I think that's it's a serious problem in our country. I think we have a really major problem, and and I know Braver Angels is through grassroots effort is trying to repair that. I don't know how that's going to happen though. I can see it between private citizens, but not necessarily making its way to those that represent us.
As the director of Braver Politics,
braver politics, yeah. But I think that, this comes down to the two-party system. I am blocking on the name right now of the Harvard economist, Michael Porter, who has done a really great analysis of the two-party system and how locked in things can become with a duopoly. And I think that's our problem. We have this duopoly that has everything locked in, has made it difficult to impossible for a third party to arise, and has locked in actually what one might describe as extremist politics. And there's also the axis that isn't talked about that much of libertarianism versus authoritarianism. And as somebody with a strong libertarian bent, I see both parties, going towards authoritarianism, and I find myself holding my nose and aligning myself with the party that at the moment seems less authoritarian.
Yeah, and I go further than that, Paul. I see at least the public narrative as a public that is beginning to develop an appetite for authoritarianism. As long as you agree with the authority, authoritarianism is okay.
Yeah.
The danger is when once that authority really gains ultimate power, which is what authorities want to do, then we're all in trouble, even if we originally agreed with the authority. And that is, and I do lean towards libertarianism also, at least in terms of my political positions. I believe in conservative values, but I don't think they should be legislated because then you run into authoritarianism. I'm hoping that it is just a narrative that the country is gaining a taste for authoritarianism, but I sometimes despair that there is a truth there.
Mm-hmm.
So my background in politics, I actually don't think that it's true that the two-party system is the problem. I see third parties win pretty regularly in the city of Seattle, for example. In deep blue and deep red places, there are openings for people to identify with other parties, and people that identify with those other parties frequently actually do win elections. Also, we spoke earlier in our conversation about the diversity of the two parties. I think it is that inter-party diversity that prevents another party from becoming significant, and a lack of organization in the people that disaffiliate from those two parties. Independents, after all, are not an affiliation to a particular identity. They are a disaffiliation away from something else. And that something else from which they're disaffiliating is often different regionally. Disaffiliating from the Republican Party in Ohio is not disaffiliating from the Republican Party in Washington State, because those may as well be two different parties. In fact, even within my state of Washington, we may as well have 4 or 5 different Republican parties. The party system is extraordinarily diverse. And when we talk about extremism, we're talking about extremes within 2 extraordinarily diverse bands and complaints about that. If a third party would rise up, it would have to be in opposition or have some significant difference that it was picking out from both the broad band of Democrats and the broad band of Republicans. Third parties succeed in small regions and tiny districts where they are significantly different from the faction of the parties that exist around them. They cannot exist at the national level because they are not significantly different at the national level because the parties are far too diverse for that. I think that authoritarianism is, in fact, a major problem. and the taste for authoritarianism. I am a committed conservative on the Pew Research scale of conservatism. And so that puts me in the company apparently of like 7% people. So it's kind of a small club. In terms of what can you do to impact that, as the director of Braver Politics, show up locally. Everyone can make a difference in their local communities. It's honestly not that hard to impact your local city council. It's not that hard to impact your school district if you live in a major city and your city council is difficult to influence. Each of these individual districts have some place where one person or 3 people or 10 people can have a significant impact without even really putting in a lot of time. Most people don't show up to their city council meetings or their county commissioner meetings, even though those are the ones that determine whether you can build a deck on your house or how much of your yard you can use. And you can change the direction of those fairly easily. This year, I've been advising a candidate for Kitsap Public Utility District. And that's another race that in a county of over 100,000 voters, probably that race will be decided by 6,000 people that vote in it.
So Elizabeth, I'm aware of time, and I believe this is going to be a 1-hour podcast. So I would like to ask each person to perhaps sum up in 1 or 2 sentences what you would like people to take away from this podcast and from our thinking here. So give a moment to think about it. And who'd like to go first?
I'll take
I know
a crack.
1 or 2 sentences makes it tough, but I think people will get more value out of the podcast if we can do that.
I'll take a shot. If there's a couple of 2 or 3 things that I hope that liberals in the blue side our friends on the blue side would recognize, is that there's a great diversity of thought in the conservative side of the conceptual frameworks. Second, that having diversities of opinion is going to lead to improved solutions for the many and very real problems that we have. The third thing I would suggest is that we care very deeply about our country. We're not anti-democratic, not at all. And that we care deeply about the welfare of our communities, the nation, people around us. And we want to work collaboratively to develop solutions.
Thank you. Who'd like to go next? Short summary.
I'll go ahead and sort of reiterate what Mark said in the beginning, that there is a wide range of opinions and perspectives on the red side, but we also have a lot of things in common, and those things are a commitment to the country. We don't want to see people at the top defining who we are and what we can do. We really believe in individual liberty. That's sort of a driving principle among libertarians, but I also think among many conservatives, and that government should be protecting those rights to make personal decisions instead of determining what it is that we can do.
Elizabeth, do you want to go, or do you want to have the last word?
I'll give it a shot. I'm trying to figure out a brief way to sum up all of my thoughts into 1 or 2 sentences, and I'm struggling. What does media and academia get wrong? Almost everything. They live in a bubble of their own design. We're geographically sorting ourselves, and that means that even when they try to reach outside their bubble, they often don't know what is or isn't representative of the bubble they're reaching into, or sometimes even which bubble they're actually reaching into and whether that's the one that they were trying to contact and trying to understand. Academia and peer review is wonderful. I rely on formal research every single day of my life. I go back to it for almost every practical decision that I make in politics, that I make about day-to-day risk assessment, living in the era of COVID, but it excludes some people. It excludes people that aren't in the ivory towers, that are working on the ground in a lot of fields that aren't hard science. And that means that often it makes claims that aren't supported by reality.
Yeah.
Academia and media need to reality test their ideas. And sometimes that means stepping outside of their peer group, because that is a bubble and that is not actually the reality of everyone else. And if you could step outside and build a different group of peers, build a group of peers that is different from you in ideology and thinking and the way that they live and the place that they live, that could be really helpful. And I think improve understanding and perceptions greatly.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. And very much what I think I was going to say. I mean, having been trained in scientific method at an early age, and later becoming very involved in the humanities, I see people, human beings, we are inherently irrational, and we are inherently, to some degree, not oriented towards reality. And so this is why it is so important to recognize and to look for ways to test our beliefs against external reality rather than consensus of people with whom we already agree or with whom we already have some association. And I think this is a lot of the courage of Braver Angels. I mean, everybody who shows up for Braver Angels is at least in some degree willing to let the other side speak. So I think that would be my plea. Let's orient ourselves towards reality and recognize that we need a lot of different people with different ideas to get as close to that as we possibly can.